Okay, so here it is. I hope you can see my presentation right now. Can you? Yes? Yes, okay. Then I can begin. Anna said that today we are here to celebrate the birthday of the greatest genius, as they say, that ever lived. But I will begin with precisely that date of his birth, because as so many things about Shakespeare, this one is also a mystery. Namely, we cannot be sure whether he was born on April 23rd, but the historians just made a conjecture that he was born on this day, and interestingly enough, he actually died on the same date in 1616. About this date of his death, we can also not be sure. So maybe one part of the allure to Shakespeare lies in the fact that he's surrounded by so many mysteries. Now, since this presentation is going to end in, I think, 15 minutes, I will have just enough time for this first part to make a brief introduction. And I'm going to speak about these mysteries that surround Shakespeare's work and his persona. And next, I'm going to speak about Shakespeare the man, the actual man who wrote these plays. So let's begin with Shakespeare the Ghost. Many critics will tell you that Shakespeare was the ultimate expression of humanity, which actually means that he dealt with so many sides of human personality that we can now apply his plays even today, although they were written so many centuries ago. His fame today rests on his 37 plays, which is a great opus, because it's such a great number, and on his 154 sonnets, as well as his narrative poems with which he began his career, as you will shortly see. Today he's hailed as the most performed playwright of all time, and plays like Richard III, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear are definitely known all around the globe, not only in England, which is why we speak about Shakespeare's universalism. He was universal in so many respects. Sorry for the break, because I have some messages popping out. Harold Bloom, who is probably one of the most famous and important Shakespearean critics, goes so far as to say that Shakespeare invented all humanity, that without Shakespeare we couldn't understand our lives properly. And this is what I'm going to speak about today. What is his secret? Well, partly the fact that he mixes his optimism with his pessimism. Of course, his pessimism tends to be, to me, more appealing, let's say. I'll come to that as well. So even in his tragedies, you will have glimpses of comedy and happy moments, the so-called comic reliefs. But the pain and the anger and the fear with which we deal every day is definitely apparent in his life. So when I say that so many mysteries surround Shakespeare, I will begin with the way he looked. That's the basic thing. Since back then there was no photography, we are not even sure what this man looked like. So let me show you what I mean by that. I will show you three different portraits of Shakespeare. Sorry, I can hear some messages as well. So please look at these portraits and don't tell me, but just think about them and choose one which actually you think is Shakespeare. These three men in the photos are actually quite different, if you ask me. And I will now explain some facts about these portraits. So on your right, you see the engraving which appeared in the first complete works of Shakespeare, published in 1623, which is called the First Folio. And I guess this portrait is the most famous that you all know. In the middle, you have the portrait which allegedly was done during his time. And if you look closely enough, you will see that he's wearing an earring, looking pretty fashionable. And the third portrait on your left, that most recently found in 2009, and it allegedly belonged to Shakespeare's patron, Southampton, who played such a great role in Shakespeare's life, as you will see. But this was not the only mystery that surrounded Shakespeare all this time. Let me tell you about other things as well. For example, there are two periods in Shakespeare's life when we do not know where he was at the time. The first period begins in 1578 when he left his grammar school, and Shakespeare was not formally educated. I'll come to that as well. All up to 1582 when he married his wife, Anne Hathaway. I'm sure you know that there's a famous actress by the same name. And I read just today that her boyfriend resembles Shakespeare. It's just a trivia. So these 4 or 5 years, during these years, he basically disappeared. We do not know what he did. Maybe he educated himself, because Shakespeare is definitely self-educated, but we can only guess. The second period, which is also called the lost years of Shakespeare, began in 1585 when his twins were born, Hamlet and Judith, and Shakespeare then moved to London. Once he got to London, we do not know what he actually did. We do know that he started his career as an actor, not a writer or a playwright. So all up to 1592, we lose the sight of him. And again, maybe he just educated himself or learned his craft. We are not sure. In 1592, he met Southampton, who became his patron. And we know that now Shakespeare was in London because one particular dramatist, Robert Greene, described Shakespeare in his pamphlet as an upstart crow, ili na srpskom skorojevička vrana. I will speak about that at the end of this lecture. So these two periods are complete mysteries to us, and I guess we tend to like people more if we know less things about them. That's just me. Another question which is not solved yet regards his authorship. It is solved in my mind, of course, but many people say that it's impossible that this particular man, William Shakespeare from Stratford upon Avon, could have written all those beautiful plays and poems. Why was this? Basically, Shakespeare's father was an illiterate man who was a glove maker, nothing more. Shakespeare, as I said, did not have a formal education, so university was not his thing. He only had a grammar school education, and he chose the life of an actor, whereas we know that in the Elizabethan times, being an actor was not something you would want to do because you would be considered a low life. Then his wife and his 2 daughters, Susanna and Judith, were also illiterate. So what was it about that man who was surrounded by an illiterate family to be able to write in such a way that appeals to humanity even today? Furthermore, we do not even have a sample of his handwriting, so that's another mystery. So regarding the authorship, especially from the 19th century onwards, people have been asking whether he was even the right man, whether he was the one who wrote these plays. William from Stratford, which is the William whom we are speaking about today, William Shakespeare, was described by one critic as a stupid, ignorant, third-rate actor. So how could it be that a middle-class actor becomes the greatest English poet, especially because of his lack of university education? Now, as you can see in my slide, there is a question here. Was this an advantage? I would usually ask my students that. Can we see the lack of university education as an advantage for Shakespeare? And I think I have to explain this. Well, because universities and academia, generally speaking, I hope you agree with me, tend to shape our beliefs and to show us only certain things so that we can learn about them. They teach us only specific things and not all of it. Whereas if you're self-educated, your imagination can run wild. And this is why I think personally that Shakespeare, along with other writers who did not have a formal education, such as, for example, George Bernard Shaw, had an imagination that was precious and that enabled them to write in the way they did. So if William from Stratford did not write the plays, who did? There are several rivals for the plays. I'm going to just show you a couple of them. Some people say it was Francis Bacon, who was Shakespeare's contemporary, and he's famous today for having written The New Atlantis, the famous, let's say, utopian or even dystopian work. Some say it was Christopher Marlowe. To me, I adore Marlowe's plays, and I think that if Marlowe had not been killed in a tavern brawl, now being an English spinal, that he would probably have become a greater poet than Shakespeare. But again, that's only my opinion. He died in 1593, and we know that Shakespeare's plays were written after that, so he does not fit the bill. Then another candidate for the place would be Edward de Vere, who was the Earl of Oxford at the time. Again, he died before Shakespeare produced King Lear, Macbeth, Anthony and Cleopatra, and so on. But this particular man could actually fit the bill, if you will, because he was a very well-educated man. And if you're interested in this topic, I suggest you watch the movie, which is called Anonymous, and it actually deals with this topic and proposes that it was Edward de Vere who wrote Shakespeare's plays. It has so many mistakes, factual mistakes, but nonetheless, it's pretty interesting to watch. Critics have gone so far as to even suggest that Queen Elizabeth I wrote Shakespeare's plays. And of course, this is a ridiculous idea, as we all know. She died in 1603, and she was a great lover of Shakespeare's art. So we should thank her for that, because she supported the theater, especially Shakespeare. But it was only after 1603 that Shakespeare actually produced his most famous plays. So these were all, or actually some of the mysteries which surround Shakespeare's character. But Shakespeare the man, he was something different altogether. So here is the list and the portraits of some of the people who affected Shakespeare's life generally and in many ways. The first one was the already mentioned Elizabeth I, during whose reign Shakespeare's theatrical company actually flourished. Once she died, Shakespeare was aware that he had to be on good terms with the king, King James I, who was a Scottish king who reigned from 1603 to 1625. So Shakespeare basically changed the name of his company into the King's Men so as to become friends with the king. Another person important for his life was definitely his wife, Anne Hathaway, whom he actually left. He left his wife, he left his children in order to go to London and pursue the career of an actor first, as I said. His children, Susanna and the twins, Hamlet and Judith, were a great part of his life, especially his boy, Hamlet, who died when he was just a child and who actually inspired Shakespeare's greatest play called Hamlet. And I'm sure you can hear the similarity between the names Hamnet and Hamlet. And finally, Southampton, the third Earl of Southampton, or Henry Wriothesley, as they pronounce it. Some pronounce it Wriothesley. He was Shakespeare's patron, and this was really important at the time, because if a playwright did not have a patron, then he couldn't write, because he wouldn't have money. So choosing Shakespeare to be his writer was a great thing for worldly literature. Just to compare, Christopher Marlowe wanted Southampton to be his patron, but the Earl refused. He specifically wanted Shakespeare to be his writer. and it was to Southampton that Shakespeare dedicates his sonnets as well as his narrative poems. And now I have 2 minutes left for this first part, and you will tell me in your comments whether this is too quick for you and whether you can see and understand everything that I'm saying. Shakespeare began his career with his narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. You can probably judge by the titles themselves that these poems are full of sexual allusions, and I will show you one just as we get back. He wrote the poems during the times of the plague, from 1592 to 1594. Both poems were dedicated to his patron, Southampton. And it's important that they were written during the plague because I want to stress this was not the only period in Shakespeare's life that the theaters were closed. Actually, the plague is going to dog the London theaters on and off for the next 30 years or so. For example, in 1603, when Queen Elizabeth died, 30,000 people died because of the bubonic plague. And even later, there were other occasions when the theaters were closed. I suggest that we end this part here so that we can just come back again and continue.
Let me just say a word. We have good news. We are not going to be stopped, so we can continue. Yeah, this is a gift from Zoom in these in these hard times. So yeah, Zoom
okay, great. So I can continue with my presentation.
Yeah, with no stopping. Yes, we have, no time limits now. You can go on.
Okay, because I was kind of hurrying because I could see the clock. Great news! Thank you so much. I guess this is even better. So let me just go back to my presentation. Where was I? The plague and the narrative poems. So I already told you that there were some sexual allusions in these 2 poems, and I want to show you one excerpt from Venus and Adonis, just to illustrate this. I'm sorry because I'm going to read the Serbian translation later on, so that you who come from Italy or I don't know, sorry, you will not understand it, but let me just read it first in English. I'll be a park, and thou shalt be my deer. Feed where thou wilt, on mountain or in dale. Graze on my lips, and if those hills be dry, stray lower, where the pleasant fountains lie. I hope you can understand, even without my translation, that Shakespeare here uses the metaphor of a park to represent the human body, so that actually Venus tells this to Adonis, and Shakespeare deliberately inverts values here and goes before his time, because he makes Venus, who is the goddess of love, woo Adonis instead of being vice versa. So it's important to say that Shakespeare basically never invented his own stories. He would always take a story from somebody else and then just rewrite it in his own way. And this is where the appeal lies. Now, in order for everyone who speaks Serbian to understand this sexual allusion, I have written down the translation for this. So let me read it in Serbian. Ja park ću biti, ti jelen u njemu. Pasi gde hoćeš, gore ili dole, usne. Ali ako hunci nisu sveži, odlutaj niže, gde sveži izvor leži. I guess now you can understand the erotic illusion present in this particular part, but the whole poem is actually like this, where we can see the goddess of love sweating because of her enormous love for Adonis, and it was quite unusual to see. So the poem actually was not really banned, but it was kind of a secret. You should read it in secret and not tell anyone else. Another controversial work from this early period were the sonnets, which were composed much earlier than they were published. They were published in 1609, but were composed much earlier. we usually think that Shakespeare wrote the sonnets simply for his friends, to circulate around his friends. And the main topic is definitely love, transience of time, the possibility of art to immortalize things. Because if you appear in a piece of art, such as Shakespeare's, you will definitely be immortal. And this is what he did with presumably Southampton. The sonnets are a separate story, and I'm so sorry I am not able to speak about them today, but maybe we can organize a separate lecture on those. It will suffice to say that what was controversial in the sonnets was that one part of them, the first part of the sonnets, was not dedicated to a woman, which was customary, but to a man, to a young man, and this has sparked many discussions about Shakespeare's probable homosexuality, which has never been proven. Could I please ask you just to mute the audio because I can hear what's going on in the background. Okay, Anna, could you mute everybody, please? Okay, I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me? Probably yes. Okay. Shakespeare did not earn money from his plays. This is an interesting fact, I think. Basically, he earned money from his theatrical companies that he owned and his theaters. In his time, he dealt with two companies. The first one was the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and when King James I became the King of England, they changed the name into the King's Men. The company actually owned two theaters. I'm absolutely sure you have heard of the first theater. It's called the Globe. And the second theater that they owned was the Blackfriars. So this is the Globe. This is my personal photo that I took in London. This globe that you can see today is not situated on the same spot as it was in Shakespeare's time, because the original globe was destroyed in a fire during the performance of Shakespeare's play Henry VIII. The globe was erected and founded in 1599, and the fire was in 1613. There are so many fun facts about the Globe, but let me just say that it was an outdoor theater. It is still today, this replica. So this means that even if it snows, even if it rains, if you have come to see the play, or as they would say, to hear the play, then you would have to stay until the end of the performance, regardless of the snow and of the rain. Another theater that they owned later on was called the Blackfriars. The difference between the Blackfriars and the Globe was that this was an indoor theater, which basically means it was artificially lighted with candles, of course not electricity, and it was much more expensive to buy the ticket for the Blackfriars. You can see the image here in the slide. And all the gallery parts that you can see were reserved for maybe the queen, the king, the lords, the barons, and so on. So people who were much higher in royal hierarchy would come to see the plays in the Blackfriars rather than the Globe. Shakespeare wrote his plays over 2 full decades, from 1590 to 1611. So we are covering the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. I personally think it's really important to contextualize things and to think about those times when the plays were actually written, because Shakespeare wrote for his own time. The fact that his plays still appeal to the imagination of humanity is another thing. So it's in a different way that we interpret his plays today. He wrote histories and then comedies. They overlapped in a way. And then, especially after his son Hamlet died, he shifted his focus to tragedies. So it was only after this great tragedy of his personal tragedy, the death of his son, that he was able to really rise to the heights that we know today. His greatest tragedies are usually called his four major tragedies: Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth, written in this particular period. Other tragedies that struck him at the time, as you can see in the slide, is his father's death and Elizabeth's death. He was actually quite attached to the queen. The last type of plays that he wrote after the tragedies were the so-called tragicomedies or romances, and this name, tragicomedy, was actually attached much later to his plays. It was not the fact that Shakespeare called them such. It was later added by the critics. To finish off this part about Shakespeare's life, or Shakespeare the man, I will tell you that he has a very interesting will. In his will, he leaves everything he has to his daughter, Susanna, his eldest daughter, and he leaves money to the poor people of his hometown, Stratford upon Avon. But one famous anecdote that goes around is that to his wife, Anne Hathaway, he left, this is a quote, "the second best bed with the furniture." The furniture refers to the linens on the bed. So he didn't even leave her the best bed, but the second best bed. And this has been a source of some controversy and even joking in Shakespearean circles. Sadly enough, Shakespeare today does not have direct descendants because by 1670, all his direct relatives have died. So today, because of this, he remains a mystery. And I think this is a good thing in a way, because it forces us to think about this man as a mysterious person who gave us something that we cannot understand, but because of his work, we can understand ourselves better. So I hope this was brief enough. I tried to keep it brief as in terms of speaking about Shakespeare's life. Let me tell you something about his position today. So I'm speaking about our Shakespeare. The quotation marks are here because we can no longer speak about Shakespeare as an English writer. He's not an English writer. He is a global phenomenon, let's say, which means he's everybody's. As one critic puts it, for he is all of ours, is he not? And I'm going to prove this to you by showing you some images here today. He has been called the soul of the age, but which age? Everybody's age. I'm definitely certain that Shakespeare will continue living on and on in centuries to come, and I'm really excited because of that. In terms of the ability to earn money from Shakespeare, this has been debated very much as well. He has become part of the global big business around the world. So people, not only English people, but again, all people around the world, use Shakespeare's plays to adapt them to suit the plays to their own conditions. And this can be done. Actually, Shakespearean text has the ability of being appropriated in so many ways. And this is why his plays are always evolving. And I will show you this on some examples. For example, you can see here two performances of Shakespeare, one in Japan and another in Korea. As you can see, Coriolanus, which is one of his, well, let's say history plays, is here performed in Japan in quite a specific way. They're using masks, and this is not specified in Shakespeare's play. What I'm trying to say is that if you change the director of the play, if you change the costumes that are used in the play, you can change the whole play written by Shakespeare. The thing is, Shakespeare never gave us elaborate instructions on how to dress a character. Basically, the directors have the freedom to choose how to perform Shakespeare, and this is what makes him able to evolve all around the world. Also in Korea, you can see some masks, and I think that using the masks is really particular for these two cultures. Another example would be filming Shakespearean plays. I just chose two examples randomly. One is the famous version of Romeo and Juliet, starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Romeo and Claire Danes as Juliet. This particular movie version of Romeo and Juliet, is set in urban Verona, but it uses Shakespeare's text. So the text is not changed, only the setting and the characters and the costumes. I mean, the way that the characters are dressed. Then you have this famous movie, Shakespeare in Love, which is not based on Shakespeare's text, but there are many quotes from his works. This here is Joseph Fiennes, who's supposed to be young Shakespeare, trying to find inspiration for his next play. And as I recall, in this movie, he meets Gwyneth Paltrow, who serves him as an inspiration for the character of Viola from the play The Twelfth Night. It's really amusing to watch, although again, like the movie Anonymous, it has many factual mistakes, but again, it's fun to watch. Then, for example, what you can see in the upper part of the slide, in the black and white image, this movie, Cesare deve morire, which is an Italian, well, let's even say documentary movie. I'm obsessed with this movie. I have seen it maybe 10 times. I have even written a paper on this movie. It's won a prestigious award in one of the festivals. What you can see here are the real prisoners from one Roman prison. So one of them is a murderer, one of them is, I don't know, a child abductor, and so on. They are preparing a performance of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And by the end of the movie, and this is real life, this is like a reality show basically, because it's documentary. By the end of the movie, they realize that Shakespeare has changed their lives. They realize that his art has taught them how to live and how to understand the conditions they are in. So if you have the opportunity, please watch this movie. It's really great. And finally, Richard III. You can see here Ian McKellen dressed as, well, Hitler. I hope you can recognize this Nazi uniform. Again, the text is the same. So this play speaks about Richard III, who was the infamous English king, upon whose death the Tudor dynasty was established. Now they changed the costumes, and we immediately get the feel of being in a Nazi camp or a Nazi country, although the text remains the same. So this is the great thing about Shakespeare, the way he can evolve, even in scripts. So look at this example here. It's manga Shakespeare. I love these comic books. So this is, I chose to show you one particular image from Romeo and Juliet. This is Juliet in manga version, and she says, "Oh fortune, all men call thee fickle." So all people call fortune or fate changeable, and she says, "Be changeable, I don't care, just bring Romeo back." Now, putting Shakespeare into comic books, I think this is quite an achievement and really interesting for young children even to read and become accustomed with his language. And finally, I have this, I'll not play it for you. I encourage you to watch it on YouTube. Seeing Schwarzenegger as Hamlet, I think it's such a precious experience. And I hope you will take some time after this lecture and find the trailer for the movie The Last Action Hero, in which you can see Arnold Schwarzenegger playing Hamlet. I don't think you ever expected that. Shakespeare did so many great things apart from this. Why do we call him our Shakespeare and not English? Well, because of all these things, and especially because of his language. Just look at these phrases that I'm sure you're familiar with, at least some of the phrases you do know. For example, I will wear my heart upon my sleeve, or in the twinkling of an eye, or vanish into thin air, or there's method in his madness, for example. All these phrases and many, many more have now become part of the English language. They are now idioms that we use on a daily basis, not even being aware that we are using Shakespearean language. So his legacy is quite huge. One repercussion of this is that many of these phrases have changed their meaning over time. And I'm going to give you one example. The phrase, sweets to the sweet. Well, let's imagine a young boy could give a flower or a candy or a chocolate to a girl whom he likes, and he would say, here's a sweet to the sweet, which means that this phrase now has a pretty romantic tone. However, originally it comes from Hamlet, from Act 5, when Queen Gertrude, who is Hamlet's mother, actually strews flowers over Ophelia's grave. So originally the phrase was used in a tragedy in a very tragic way, because Gertrude says, let me read it to you, sweets to the sweet, farewell. I hoped thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife. I thought thy bride bed to have decked, sweet maid, and not have strewed thy grave. But today we use it in a romantic way. Sweets to the sweet here literally means sweets are flowers and the sweet is Ophelia. So the queen uses the phrase to say goodbye to Ophelia. Just let's take a very quick look at some nouns and adjectives and verbs that came to the English language from Shakespeare's plays. I'm not going to read, of course, them all, but just some of them. For example, bedroom, retirement, accused, addiction, assassination, or gossip, or negotiate, torture, for example. Adjectives. Oh, adjectives, let's say lonely, selfie, worthless, disgraceful. All these words and many more, this is just a selection, come from Shakespeare's works in a way that they may have been invented much earlier, but Shakespeare's works are the first piece of work where they are documented. So they would be the original source for these words, although this does not mean that he actually invented all these words. Maybe he did, maybe he did not, but he definitely wrote them down first in his works. He was definitely not afraid to play with words. And I'm going to show you this in this example. So this is his longest word that he invented. Let me try and read it. Honorific abitudinitatibus. That's the way to read this word. And it comes from the play Love's Labor's Lost, in Serbian, Uzaludni ljubavni trud, spoken by Hostard. Later in literature, I maybe can think of James Joyce as being able to play with words in such a genius way. I'm not going to tell you, much about Shakespeare's language because this part is reserved for my students only, but and it would make my lecture too long. I'm going to be finishing off soon. But let me just tell you this, that Shakespeare used blank verse for his plays. Blank verse means that there is no rhyme, but there is a regular meter and rhythm in the lines. What this actually means is that when somebody, an actor, pronounces Shakespeare's lines, you can hear it's poetry, you know it's poetry, and yet it sounds like ordinary speech. It's so amazing, and it cannot be explained properly, I guess. The meter that he would usually use was called iambic pentameter. And this language, I think it's too specific to talk about today. And I have many examples here in this presentation, but I will not give it to you because of the time. Apart from blank verse, he also used rhymes in some respects. For example, if he would want to close the act at the very end of a scene, he would use a rhymed couplet so that you know, the actors know when they hear the rhyme that it's their turn to go on stage. He would also use prose in certain parts, and his prose is usually reserved for characters who come from lower parts of society, such as his servants, for example, and generally people who do not belong to royalty. So it is especially important if you want to read Shakespeare and really enjoy his plays, to pay attention to his rhythm and his meter. I usually tell my students that his lines resemble a heartbeat and go do-do, 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 do-do. Now I just imitated an iambic pentameter because the second part of the syllable is actually stressed. Let me give you an example. To be or not to be. These would be 3 iams in a row. But again, I cannot come to that in detail today. I will finish off this brief lecture on Shakespeare in celebration of his birthday by just wrapping up and telling you something about this word megaphor. It's not a mistake, so it's not a spelling or typo mistake. It's not metaphor, it's megaphor. Anna actually mentioned that Shakespeare was a genius, and one critic said that Shakespeare possessed something which is called demon in mythology. When you say demon today, you immediately think of a devil, I guess. But demon originally in mythology means demigod, somebody who is partly human, partly God. And this same critic said that not so many people actually throughout humanity have possessed this demon within them. One of them was Shakespeare. We can think of some people who actually had this demon, like Tesla, for example, or Albert Einstein, let's say, maybe Homer in literature. You can guess some of your own. Shakespeare was definitely somebody whose genius cannot be explained, and this is why I call him the megaphor of humanity. So somebody whose works we should use to understand other type of literature. And this is what I will finish my lecture with. But let me first quote something that I find is quite interesting, and we can apply this to Shakespeare as well. This quote comes from the 12th Night. It is spoken by a character called Malvolio, and goes like this. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. I guess all these lines, these 3 particular lines, can be applied to Shakespeare as well. If we agree that he was born with a demon inside him, then he was born great. He also achieved greatness by being careful enough to educate himself. And there is also true to the last line when Malvolio says, some have greatness thrust upon them. So today, we cannot say that all of Shakespeare is good. I feel the need to say this and to tell you that I personally think that not all of Shakespeare is good. His comedies are, let's say, amusing, or that's only my opinion. His histories are excellent, really. His tragedies, however, are superb. So if I were to choose which part of his opus I would definitely reread over and over again, it would be his tragedies. But there are some parts that are not actually good. There are many repetitions, and this is because Shakespeare used to write to earn money, for not only for himself, but also for the actors who belonged to his theatrical company. So when we speak about Shakespeare, it's not fair to just stress the good things. We should speak about the bad and the ugly. And I want you all to be aware of this. Let me give you some examples. I already mentioned this name, Robert Greene, who was England's first professional dramatist, and he was kind of jealous of Shakespeare for being more popular than other dramatists of the time. Now, these dramatists include Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, for example. All these playwrights were had university education, and they were called the university wits. Shakespeare had no education, and yet he was more popular than them. And Robert Greene was jealous, and he called Shakespeare an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers. Mislim da sam već rekla na srpskom, skoro je vička vrana koja se kiti perjem učenih ljudi. Let me just continue with the quote. That with his tiger's heart, wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he's as well able to bombast out of verse as the best of you. So the bolded parts of this quote refer to phrases from Shakespeare's plays. Tiger's heart is a phrase from Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 3, and this phrase refers to Queen Margaret, who is the most vicious and cruel of all Shakespearean heroines. She's so great. A player's hide means that Robert Greene alludes to Shakespeare being an actor before being a playwright. Just to make sure that everybody recognizes this as Shakespeare, Robert Greene says shake scene. Na srpskom bi to bilo vinotres, svakoga zore. So Robert Greene was not delighted with Shakespeare at all. Another famous author who deserves a mention here, who hated Shakespeare, was Tolstoy. According to Tolstoy, he read Shakespeare's plays many times, not only in Russian, but also in the original. Tolstoy claimed to have read all of Shakespeare maybe 5 to 6 times, and he couldn't understand what was so good about them because he never understood Shakespeare. These are his words. But having read one after the other works regarded as his best, not only did I feel no delight, but I felt an irresistible repulsion and tedium. He was bored with Shakespeare's plays, especially King Lear, which today is hailed as the top of his expression. On the other side, there were people who acknowledged Shakespeare's genius, such as one of his most formidable rivals. His name was Ben Jonson, and I'm sure nobody has heard of Ben Jonson today, if you don't study literature, of course. And yet, Ben Jonson's blank verse was perfect, whereas Shakespeare's was not. Shakespeare used to break rules. He wasn't so perfect, and this is why we love him today. Even Ben Jonson admitted upon Shakespeare's death that he was not of an age, but for all time. And finally, Harold Bloom, he is so honest and certain when he says, quote, Shakespeare is the canon. He sets the standard and the limits of literature. I will just briefly explain this. When Bloom says Shakespeare is the canon, he means that we cannot even read other books if we don't know our Shakespeare. I guess this also applies to the Bible. The Bible being just a bit more popular than Shakespeare, but the two are definitely something which we all should read. And I guess when you read other books, if you know Shakespeare, then you will understand those books in a different way. For example, I recently read The Picture of Dorian Gray with my students, and last year we read Moby Dick. And I know that they would have understood both books in a different way had they known their Shakespeare, but we teach Shakespeare after these courses, unfortunately. And this is, I guess, I have only 2 slides left. Let me just remind you, when you read Shakespeare, pay attention to the music in his lines. George Bernard Shaw said, "In a deaf nation, Shakespeare's plays would have died long ago." So again, just let me repeat this. It is not his plots that are interesting. It is his lines, his language, and his music that are so great. One example that I'm going to give you comes from the play King John, when King John says to another character called Bastard, "Be Mercury, set feathers to thy heels, and fly like thought from them to me again." Why this example? Well, Shakespeare could have said to the bastard, "Just go there very quickly and come back as soon as possible, bring me the news." And yet he chooses to say this in such a beautiful way, comparing the bastard to Mercury and using this wonderful metaphor. Lastly, this is my last slide for today. I hope you learned something or maybe found this amusing. I'm showing this painting by George Rumney. The painting is called "The Infant Shakespeare Attended by Nature and the Passions." You can see the baby Shakespeare here in the middle, and the main passions or emotions here in the painting are first nature. Nature is the veiled woman above the baby. Then you have the naked woman next to the baby, that's joy. And the woman in a blue dress is sorrow. Behind joy, you have love, hate, and jealousy. And behind sorrow, you have anger, envy, and fear. Now, if we just enumerate these passions and emotions, we can guess and grasp how beautifully Shakespeare actually dealt with all of these. And this is why I like to say that Shakespeare understood our weaknesses so well that we cannot deal to part with him. I guess this is what I had to tell you today. I will now stop sharing and turn to Anna. If you have some questions, I guess you can